With that, it is a full moon somewhere at some point in time. To tune back in if it's not a full moon where you're watching. And I can't think of a better place to start than with werewolves, one of the most iconic creatures in all of horror movies. They stalk the streets of London, reigning terror. They stalk the streets of Hogwarts and chase down Harry Potter and his friends. They stalk the hearts of young romantics like Bella here in the Twilight series. And for you Twilight fans out there, you can butcher me in the chat because I understand there's a distinction between the Twilight wolves here and actual werewolves. But for our purposes, they're werewolves. Even Batman has fought werewolves in the past. At this point in pop culture history, if you haven't fought a werewolf, I don't know how you can call yourself a hero. So somebody like Luke Skywalker has some real work cut out for them. They can even ball. A+, no notes. Ball don't lie when the vampire has it, or when the werewolf has it. So throughout history, werewolves have been sort of ever present in this space existing between fiction and real life. They're portrayed as creatures of the night, men, humans who are afflicted by this disease, whatever you want to call it, that causes them to transmorph, to turn into a bloodthirsty beast who has an unquenchable appetite for death and destruction. And no good vampire tale is out there unless you have a hero to help slay the beast. The problem with these tales is that werewolves are impervious to most weaponry that humans have. This is one of the sort of driving forces with these stories. Not only are they bloodthirsty, fearsome, strong beyond measure, but they're really hard to kill. Now, this is where the silver bullet enters the picture. And for our purposes, the silver bullet has some anchoring, as do werewolves in the real world. So I want to take you back to France in the 18th century. So this would be the 1760s, give or take a few years. We're in the south of France, and there is a creature that is terrifying, or perhaps creatures, depending on which account you listen to, that's terrorizing the countryside in this idyllic part of France. Over the course of several years, there are 113 deaths attributed to this beast. You see an artist rendering here, far bigger than a wolf, far bigger than a dog, much more ferocious and deadly than any animal that the villagers around that area knew. 98 of these individuals were found partially eaten, throats torn out, just a gruesome, gruesome scene. This is perhaps the genesis point, this beast of Gévaudan, as it became known, for our modern day werewolf tales. And like any good werewolf tale, a hero emerges, a local hunter who fells the beast. He takes it down, supposedly with none other than a silver bullet. Now, in hindsight, the part about the bullet being silver, perhaps it having sort of spiritual qualities, etc., that seems to have come decades later in a retelling of the story. Needless to say, this is your origin point, perhaps for all of our modern vampire lore there in 18th century France. And there, the silver bullet sprung from a hunter's, supposedly, rifle into the modern vernacular. This piece of armament has wound its way so deeply into the public psyche that it's just a phrase now. When you say something is a silver bullet, what's the magic tool that's going to solve your problem? It's treated as something beyond just a weapon. It is a solution, and the solution here in our context is taking down an unkillable beast. And so it got a legal nerd like myself thinking in the context of IHL, as a normal human being does. And I asked, is this an illegal weapon? The silver bullet seems to have some crazy power. It is able to take down this beast that is otherwise unkillable, but does it run afoul of international humanitarian law? Well, international humanitarian law, as many of you know, this is the body of international law that governs armed conflict. And while it certainly governs the way in which we fight, so things like tactics and perhaps strategy, IHL also regulates the means of warfare. So things like weapons. IHL has quite a bit of regulation in this area. Things like chemical weaponry, which we'll talk more about in our next section, blinding laser weapons, so more modern technology. And yes, ammunition is also regulated by IHL. When it comes to new weapons, novel weaponry, so you're hunting that beast of Gévaudan in France, and you want to roll out a new weapon that you think will be effective against a beast like this, well, that's where Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions from 1977 comes into play. And Article 36 there lays out a pretty basic rule, and that is that if you're introducing a new weapon, if you're developing a new weapon for armed conflict, because that's where IHL applies, you've got to make sure as a state party to the Geneva Conventions that that weapon has to be able to comply with IHL, whether its use, perhaps its design, would otherwise be prohibited by IHL. That's an obligation of those states parties to consider before they roll that out. Now, the Additional Protocol 1 doesn't lay out all the steps. It doesn't dictate a process for this. Every country has their own approach, but that consideration must be given. And so let's give that consideration to the silver bullet here. We'll conduct our own Article 36 review here. Well, ammunition, as I said, is regulated by IHL. It's one of those means of warfare that falls within the scope of IHL. And there are historical cases of ammunition, of bullets, in fact, that remain banned to this day. A classical example, I've got a couple here. We've got some exploding munitions on the top right there. Those were used against personnel in World War II. And then more famously, the bottom picture are what are known as dum-dum bullets or expanding bullets. These bullets that when they hit the target, a human target, they would expand very broadly, much more so than a normal bullet, and cause a pretty grievous wound. Now, if we're weighing the comparison between these two, it's important to understand why rounds like this, why ammunition like this is prohibited. And at its core is a concept known as unnecessary suffering. And so the ban of munitions like this is anchored in the fact that they cause unnecessary suffering. Well, begs the question, what does that mean? That seems like a pretty broad phrase. Well, generally speaking, we're talking about harm that goes beyond what's absolutely necessary to neutralize an enemy, right? You can kill an enemy in a number of ways, but there are certain weapons, there are certain weapon types, certain tactics that go beyond that. It's simply beyond this sort of line in the sand that IHL has drawn. Now, we know that a silver bullet can cause tremendous damage to a werewolf. Side note on this picture, if you haven't seen the 1980s Stephen King movie Silver Bullet, go watch it. Do yourself. It's definitive. It's amazing. And maybe you didn't know that Stephen King wrote a book and had a movie about werewolves. But clearly this werewolf is suffering right here. He is injured. He's in the final moments of his werewolf life, having been shot by a silver bullet here. And so this begs the question, this seems like a high degree of suffering. Wouldn't this put a silver bullet into the same category as, say, a dum-dum round? What's important to note that when we talk unnecessary suffering, what we're not talking about is a ban on any suffering at all. IHL doesn't operate to prohibit any amount of suffering in war. That would be an unrealistic, although admirable, objective. If IHL had such an unrealistic rule like that, it just wouldn't be followed. People would just ignore it and treat it as a fine sort of academic exercise, but impractical in actual armed conflict. What IHL does instead is it draws that line in the sand, as I said, and it differentiates normal suffering that is going to happen inevitably through use of military force and unnecessary suffering. But the two aren't the same. And when we consider the characteristics of a silver bullet, it is really critical to ask why the silver bullet is effective against a werewolf. It's not just a high caliber weapon. In fact, in many werewolf stories, it's a revolver. It's a small caliber pistol firing one of these bullets that takes down this otherwise unkillable beast. It has to do with the properties of silver. So silver, sort of in myth and legend, is regarded as this pure and sacred metal. It has lots of religious overtones to it. In some circles, it's sort of associated with the moon as a precious metal. Werewolves being creatures of the night, creatures of the moon. There's said to be some connection there that affects the bullet's ability. And so here you're using this pure sacred metal shaped into a munition against this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad, evil beast in a werewolf. And so that sort of spiritual pureness counteracts that evilness, and there you have a dead werewolf. What we're in essence boiling this down to is that a silver bullet's an effective weapon design. That's why it's used. It's not used because it's a tank round that can obliterate a target, or it is somehow going to cause some substantially grievous injury that's going to cause the werewolf to wail and whoop and holler. That's very different than dum-dum rounds. And dum-dum rounds are a great example because they were designed to inflict terrible wounds. They took an otherwise normal bullet and said, how can we take this weapon or this munition that will cause serious injury, that will neutralize an enemy, and how do we make it worse? How do we mold this weapon so that when it hits the human body, it causes perhaps an unfixable wound that is terribly painful? And there you have a weapon, a munition that's designed to inflict those terrible wounds as opposed to an effective weapon design. And so what you have here is a really important distinction with the silver bullet, and that is that military necessity, the need to have a munition made of a material that can take down your target, it is the only way to take down your target. That is what drives the weapon's design and the weapon's use. That necessity dictates everything. Whereas in the case of these banned munitions, such as dum-dum rounds, you really have no necessity whatsoever. The bullet, in the context of a normal armed conflict between humans, a normal bullet will, in most cases, do the trick. A dum-dum round developed against personnel was simply beyond the pale in the eyes of the drafters, in the eyes of states parties to much of IHL's core treaties. And necessity is echoed, this sort of necessity behind a weapons design is echoed in other modern munitions. An example I'll give you is a depleted uranium shell, right? A large tank shell normally that's enhanced using radioactive material. Now that weapon's not designed to use that radioactivity, that depleted uranium, to inflict some terrible wound on the enemy. No, the necessity of finding a way to punch through thick armor, composite armor on things like tanks, that drove a particular design for that munition that caused the developers to integrate depleted uranium because it was an effective way to make it through that armor. The same could be said here for the silver bullet being used against an otherwise invulnerable werewolf. And so for our panel here, these very nervous werewolves here, sorry again, Twilight fans, they're eager to hear the result of all this analysis. And, I'm sad to say, unfortunately, that silver bullets are lawful weapons under IHL. So, no shade on all of you vampires. I wish you all the best, but they are lawful when they're used against you. Let's move on to the video game / movie realm into the world of Resident Evil. Now, Resident Evil, this is a long-running video game series dating back to my childhood, the mid-90s, beginning with that very first one in the top left and echoing on through the decades. This video game series has spawned a number of movies. that Mila Jovovich as an actress has seemingly cornered the market on. I fear that when she retires, that will be the end of Resident Evil movies altogether. How do you do them at this point without her being the star? But nonetheless, it is a massive franchise spanning both the video game console world and the silver screen. And the core story revolves around zombies, sort of that classic horror type creature, and zombies on the loose in a Midwestern American town, a fictional town in Midwestern America known as Raccoon City. These creatures get loose, cause chaos, and when I was a kid playing this video game for the first time, was very scared to be saddled with the burden of having to clean up this mess. And that mess, that zombie mess, is attributable to one entity and one entity alone, at least in the origin points of this series, and that is this company right here, the Umbrella Corporation. Now, Umbrella is a multinational company, and as multinational companies go, it is involved in a lot. It does a lot of things within its business: cosmetics, health foods, the transportation sector, machine building, consumer goods, and oh, by the way, a little addendum, bioweapons. I suppose we can't let that one slide, so let's focus on this. Don't think you're here to hear me talk about cosmetic development. So the Umbrella Corporation has a very secret hush-hush bioweapons research division. And that bioweapons research division, as the story goes, comes up with a breakthrough virus. This virus, as you see here, is known as the T virus. I think it should have been called the Z virus, given the results of it, but that's, for something else. Maybe that was copyright. I don't know when they came up with this. But nonetheless, the T virus, the objective here, this is a viral strand that is synthesized. And the idea is to take a dead body and capitalize on sort of the small remaining electric charge left in the brain after death and reanimate that dead body into a shambling creature with basic motor functions, the ability to kill, and no real thought process other than the drive to kill in order to eat. So that is the impetus behind this weapons design. Obviously, things go wrong. Those zombies escape this underground laboratory. They make their way out into Raccoon City, and that's where you have a 12-year-old like me coming in to clean up the mess and be scared to death along the way. Poor Raccoon City gets saved, and I wish that were the end of the story, but like any good franchise in video game or movies, no, it's not that easy to just solve it. I was terrified to see that Resident Evil 2 came out because I had just conquered that zombie apocalypse, only for it to break out all over again. So let's talk about the T virus. And as I said, like a good legal nerd, I look at this now in my current role and I ask, well, can a private company violate IHL? What we're talking about here, obviously, is a bioweapon. We'll get into that definition here in a minute, but we're talking about an umbrella, a multinational corporation. When we talk the rest of IHL, we're typically talking about states, countries, maybe non-state armed groups, and how they either follow or don't follow the rules. You don't really get into talking about private companies too much. But when it comes to bioweapons, including biological agents, such as a virus, they are governed by a revolutionary multinational treaty from 1972 known as the BWC, the Biological Weapons Convention. Now, the BWC was revolutionary because although by the time 1972 rolled around, bioweapons were sort of customarily regarded as outlawed, there was no treaty on the books that dealt with the problem of them, that dealt with the, say, development, procurement, transfer, stockpiling of these weapons. And nations came together. This is a nearly universally ratified treaty, about 189 signatories to date to this convention. There are only 190 some odd countries in the world, so it gives you a pretty good scope of the positive reception this treaty had. But more importantly, as importantly, this was the first international treaty, the first piece of IHL to unilaterally ban an entire category of WMDs. Now, I use the term weapons of mass destruction because that applies to bioweapons. By their very nature, by their design, perhaps, they are uncontrollable. When you release these weapons, you lose control of that agent. It spreads, perhaps without containment, and you have, as the term says, mass destruction. So it is a classical WMD, and it remains the only WMD that has this sort of widespread support in banning, thanks to the BWC. Now, the guts of the BWC, the operative portion, it bans all aspects of chemical weapon or biological weapons, excuse me. The development, the procurement, production, stockpiling, acquisition, transfer, all the four corners that could be involved with dealing with bioweapons, they are banned under this treaty. States agreed to get rid of their stockpiles. It is comprehensive in nature, with the idea of stamping out this scourge. Now, let's bring this back to Resident Evil. You absolutely have a biological agent in the T virus. A bio agent is defined as a virus that can cause, if released, sickness and or death. The T virus certainly qualifies for that. And the BWC also deals with delivery systems for bioweapons. That's what makes a bioweapon a bioweapon. You have an agent paired with a weaponization ability, a delivery system, and you have a unique one here, a dead body. It's kind of unusual in nature, but the T virus, as I said, is meant to reanimate the dead. So this is an open and shut case, right? The BWC bans it, so we can just move on, right? Well, not so fast, because I'd like to introduce you to my not so good friend Brad here. Stock image Brad is from the Umbrella Corporation. He's joining us as a guest today, and he's the vice president of the Department of Not Our Problem within the Umbrella Corporation. And Mr. Clip Art Brad here has some thoughts. He would like you to know that treaties like the BWC, well, they're between states parties. They're between nations, countries. Nation states enter into these international pacts, not companies, not private entities. They're just out there trying to make a profit, trying to deliver shareholder value. That's all the Umbrella Corporation is trying to do. Leave them out of this. They want no part, and they can't violate, as a private entity, the BWC. Now, the wrinkle here, Brad, is that the BWC contains kind of a unique provision here that's designed to address that gap. Because technically, Brad's right. The BWC is only enforceable, it's only applicable to those states who have signed it. That's any international treaty. If you don't ratify it, if you're not a state party to that treaty, you're not bound by it. In the BWC, as you see here, it mandates that states, those nations that have signed on to this, have to take measures to extend that reach of the BWC. So prevent development, procurement of bioweapons within their borders, within their jurisdiction. So this is the treaty coming together and saying, hey, states, look, you as a country are bound, but you also have an obligation to do stuff within your own country in order to help expand the reach of this treaty. Now, the BWC can't tell a state exactly what to do. It can't force a state to pass a law. It can't force a state to do anything in particular. It leaves that up to countries, but the US is a great example of what most countries have done in response to this portion, which is to enact criminal legislation. Here you have 18 U.S. Code Section 175. This is part of the United States Criminal Code. This basically ports over the operative portions of the BWC and criminalizes that conduct. So it outlaws development, production, possession, acquisition of biological agents and weapons. It extends its reach to influencing others to do the same. And this is a very serious law. If violated, it carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. So it's taken very seriously, but this is sort of that domestic reach in action from the BWC. And here you see this flow. You have, and this happens elsewhere in IHL, but it's on display here in spades in the Resident Evil games, where you have international treaty law that has its own sort of universe and globe. It has gaps that are often filled by domestic laws, such as Section 175 here. Though those domestic laws are what are used to rein in the conduct of private actors, so that the gap is filled, so that you don't go with entities being able to run an end around the treaty law and defeat its entire purpose. Now, the result is the T-Virus and the Umbrella Corporation, well, they violated both the BWC and Section 175. And I say both. You're thinking, well, Thomas, you just told us the BWC doesn't directly apply to corporations. I mean, you beat Brad. Why are you going back on that argument? That's my achievement on this webinar, is defeating a clip art character that I created and put in here. But nonetheless, in the story, if you're familiar with the video games or the movie, the Umbrella Corporation, because you need for a proper horror story, a large spanning secret conspiracy, the Umbrella Corporation is conspiring secretly with the government to develop this bioweapon. They are doing the dirty work to deliver an effective weapon to the military. And so there you have, because the government in this case is procuring, acquiring, getting another entity to develop bioweapons. That is a classic violation of the BWC. Also, Umbrella itself is violating Section 175. And here in the United States, corporations, as in other parts of the world, they can commit criminal violations. They're prosecuted for crimes all the time, and sometimes that criminal liability extends to individuals within the corporation. I'm not going down that rabbit hole, but what you have here is a classic example of a violation of both. Now, because art often imitates life, if you've played through enough of the Resident Evil games, you see the game sort of catch up to the status of international law, recognizing that there are gaps in enforcement in the Biological Weapons Convention. You read that cover to cover, there's no BWC police. There's no innate built-in enforcement mechanism. There's no strike force from the UN that's job is to go enforce this treaty. Well, that's recognized actually in the video games. After the disaster that destroyed Raccoon City, the UN gets together, or excuse me, the world gets together. They create the BSAA, the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Like needing a wide-ranging conspiracy, you also need a mouthful of an acronym to be a good video game. And so the BSAA exists to fill that gap. It comes under the control of the United Nations. In the storyline of the video games, it has its own sort of paramilitary force to go out and regulate this. In true circular fashion, if you go deep enough into the games, the BSAA ends up using zombies themselves. So this conspiracy wraps all the way around and eats itself from the tail up. I won't go that deep into Resident Evil lore, but if you've played the game, if you've watched the movie, understand that you're watching an international, an IHL treaty in action, and kind of a cool component in that domestic enforcement extension of it. All right, let's wrap up with one of my favorite movies of all time, Ghostbusters 2. No shade to Ghostbusters 1, but as a kid, I was introduced to these in backwards order. So I saw Ghostbusters 2 first. It captured my heart. I would drive in the Ecto 1A if I could, but, you know, that's a dream for another day. So you can't talk about Ghostbusters 2 without talking about like one of the best scenes in all of movie history, which is riding the Statue of Liberty into battle, which is what the Ghostbusters do. They're not sightseeing here. They're going to fight a demon. And if you haven't learned about me yet and the way that my brain works, you know the exact question that I'm asking when I'm watching this. Well, is that legal? I know they have to fight the battle, but is that a violation of IHL? We'll get to that in a second. Let's get you up to speed if you are not familiar, if it's been a while. Ghostbusters 2 set 5 years after the original Ghostbusters. So we're in 1989 New York City, and we're sort of in the wake of their epic battle, the Ghostbusters epic battle against Gozer, this sort of supernatural being, all powerful, and the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. This battle causes tremendous damage and destruction to New York City. Understandable collateral damage in the sort of paranormal armed conflict that exists, and that destruction has consequences for the Ghostbusters. They're sued into oblivion by the state of New York, by New York City. By the time Ghostbusters 2 starts, they're in dire straits. You see this famous courtroom scene at the beginning, and the Ghostbusters aren't even Ghostbusters. They've been disbanded when the movie starts. They're out there cosplaying as themselves, going to birthday parties for kids who really just wanted He-Man instead. It's a sad time to be a Ghostbuster. But enter Vigo von Hamburg, aka the Scourge of Carpathia, the Sorrow of Moldova, Vigo the Cruel, Vigo the Despised, Vigo the Unholy. If I had 10% of those nicknames, I'd feel really good about myself. But nonetheless, Vigo is the big bad in Ghostbusters 2. He starts out the movie as an oil painting. He's being restored by this genius here, Milos. Milos is a sort of curator, an art restorer, and he's working on restoring this painting. It just so happens that that painting is trapping sort of this the spirit of this creature. I say creature because Vigo was a real man in the story. He was a real historical figure, this war criminal, coincidentally, and tyrant of the 16th century, just a bloodthirsty ruler. And since then, he's sort of been trapped in demonic form in some sort of nether region, and this painting is his gateway. Well, down below the city, sort of unbeknownst to the Ghostbusters, you have this little pink river here. And to steal a classical science, pseudoscientific line from Egon, this is psychomagnetheric slime. This is a river of that slime flowing through New York City. It sort of exists as, I guess, a byproduct from when Gozer roamed New York City in the first movie. But this slime has now become really supercharged by, you guessed it, the bad vibes of New York City. So all the hate, anger, all this negative energy floating around the city, this is supercharging this slime and causing all sorts of paranormal events to come up. And, if you're a 16th century warlord trapped in a painting in demonic form, this presents an opportunity. You're going to take that slime, you're going to add it to a mind-controlled fool at the museum, and in true evil fashion, you're going to find a baby, in this case, Oscar. Oscar did no wrong, but you're going to find a baby as the human vessel to bring you back to life. That is Vigo's ultimate plan, and his whole goal here is the Vigo World Tour 1989. I don't think he knows what exactly he wants to do. He just wants to come back and wreak havoc once again in our world. And it's up to the Ghostbusters to stop him, but they're impeded in their effort when he takes that psychomagnetheric slime, say that 10 times fast, and encases the museum in it. It's this like seemingly impenetrable shield. You can't just walk in the front door with it or through it. And he's trying to buy time until he can reanimate himself and become all powerful. Enter the Statue of Liberty. As a kid, there was nothing cooler than seeing the Statue of Liberty come to life, be controlled by a Nintendo NES Advantage controller, something I dreamed of having as a kid, and walk down Midtown with an NYPD escort. They, I guess, didn't stop to ask questions. They just rallied up and escorted the Ghostbusters. So let's get back to the central question. Is riding the Statue of Liberty into battle, because they go straight to the museum and they use the Statue of Liberty to crash through that slime barrier and do battle against Vigo himself. Is that use of the Statue of Liberty legal under IHL? What a great way to spend your evening considering questions like this. You're never going to be able to watch Ghostbusters 2 and not think of this again, so you're welcome for that. So IHL, as you know, most of us understand it, it exists to protect humans. The whole body of law that is IHL, it originated out of a desire to affect or help fallen soldiers on the battlefield, soldiers who otherwise didn't have much in the way of protections. And then those workers, those medical aid workers or other civilians who were attempting to render medical care and went into harm's way to do it. That began the evolution of IHL, and the core of it deals with protections for human beings. We don't typically think of protections for property around it. So it begs the question whether IHL protects things, historic sites, things like the Statue of Liberty. And the answer is resoundingly yes. That's something, we have something here that's relevant, known as cultural property. So it's sort of a special subset of property. And the Statue of Liberty absolutely qualifies as cultural property. So under IHL, the cultural property is just sort of simply property that has sort of cultural value to humanity. Some may argue back and forth on any piece of cultural property and it's how it meets that definition. But I'd submit to you that this gift from the French government, this icon of freedom and sort of an icon of America in New York City, this classically qualifies as cultural property. It's old Lady Liberty herself. Now, protections for cultural property, they're not new. They have evolved over time, but we can trace here, at least in the United States, their roots back to the United States Civil War and something called the Lieber Code from 1863. The Lieber Code is promulgated by President Lincoln in the middle of the war. And despite the stakes, so the very fate of the United States as a country rests on the outcome of this war, and yet Lincoln thought it important enough to, in the middle of all that, with those stakes, issue a set of orders to the Union Army in the field that were all IHL related. And one of those features within the Lieber Code is a protection for certain property, classical works of art, libraries, scientific collections. There was a judgment, a value judgment, that there is certain property deserving of particularized protection, not just normal civilian houses, that sort of thing. This sort of special class of specially regarded things because of their value to society as a whole. Well, the Statue of Liberty certainly qualifies as a work of art, and works of art, as conflicts advanced and became more destructive, became an increasing target of not just outright destruction, but theft, all sorts of terrible results for these really, cultural staples across Europe and elsewhere. And so in the wake of all of this destruction and looting and theft in World War II, in 1954, you have what's known as the Hague Cultural Property Convention. We'll just call it the Hague Convention for our purposes here. And what Hague did was sort of advance the ball quite a bit on protections for cultural property. So it lays down a basic rule that cultural property is protected from intentional destruction unless there's imperative military necessity. So unless you really need to use force that's going to end up destroying or damaging that cultural property, it's protected. The problem with that basic rule here is that that's not what the Ghostbusters are trying to do. They're not setting out to destroy the Statue of Liberty. They're in enough trouble as it is when this movie starts. They need a big, giant thing to be able to smash through this slime barrier. And what better thing to do that with than the torch-holding arm of this statue outside New York City? So they're not destroying it. They're using it in battle. And that's not really what this basic rule is intended to cover. So where does that leave us? Well, an important extension of that baseline rule. So the base is that cultural property is protected unless there's imperative military necessity, but that protection can be lost. It can fall away. That shield can collapse if that property is misused. And classically speaking, we're talking about misuse being taking that object and using it for military purposes. So think of maybe using a museum as a military headquarters, right? Or perhaps using the Statue of Liberty to march on your demonic enemy, controlling it with the greatest video game controller of all human history, the NES Advantage. I'm not bitter that I didn't get it for Christmas in the early 90s, but that's a matter for another video entirely. But this is a classic military use. And so this matters how the Ghostbusters are using it. The fact that they choose, of all things, to use the Statue of Liberty, it kind of dovetails right into the trouble that they were in with collateral damage in the first movie, because while the general rule from Haig doesn't apply to how they're using it here, they're not trying to destroy it. By using it for a military purpose to go against Vigo, to attack him, they're causing that protection it has to drop. It isn't a crime to use or misuse cultural property for military purposes, but it does jeopardize the cultural property. The point of the rule is to try to protect that property to the maximum extent possible. And so when the Ghostbusters choose, of all things, to use Lady Liberty here, they're putting her in harm's way. And so I don't know that they had time to consider that, or the Hague Convention, but that's sort of the baseline here. Now, Hague itself advanced. In 1999, a few decades later, the second protocol to the Hague Convention came into being. And the second protocol really sought to ramp up the protections for cultural property. In the intervening years since 1954, lots of armed conflicts affected a lot of cultural property, and there was a lot of misuse, rampant misuse of cultural property for military purposes. So the Hague, the second protocol, attempted to get at that problem by saying, well, hey, there's a certain class of cultural property. So sort of the most valuable cultural property, the kind of thing that a country would put an item on the list for, the exact kind of thing, the exact kind of list that the United States would probably put the Statue of Liberty on. Like these are our most precious artifacts and pieces of cultural property. If those objects are on that list, if they're seeking specialized protection by extension, it is unlawful to use or convert that property into a military objective. So go back to the original convention, that 1954 rule, and it didn't criminalize the use, right? You could use it, you were just endangering the property. Well, now the second protocol actually criminalizes that use itself of certain types of cultural property. And I would submit to you that the Statue of Liberty would likely fall into that. And that's exactly what the Ghostbusters do, right? They're not up there to sightsee and take some photos of the New York skyline. They're there to do battle against a demonic war criminal from the 16th century. And so this seems like a violation of the second protocol, right? Well, the result is an important wrinkle here, and it's a sort of an extension of the reality that the second protocol sits in. And that is that it is not widely ratified, in stark contrast to the Biological Weapons Convention, which has sort of near universal support. The second protocol to Hague has very limited support internationally. And importantly, in the case of the Ghostbusters, it's not ratified here in the United States. So that means the United States is not bound by the provisions of the second protocol. As importantly, the rule, the notion that it's unlawful to use or convert cultural property for military purposes, well, that's not treated as customary international law too. So that's not treated as a longstanding custom that perhaps has the same weight and force of law. So that's good news for the Ghostbusters, right? That bodes well for their use of Old Lady Liberty here. And I would call this lawful, but dangerous, because who knows what's going to happen when they face off against Vigo. I don't know what demonic 16th century war criminals have. Maybe they have laser eyes, and maybe those laser eyes can shoot and blow up our precious Statue of Liberty. And wouldn't that be a shame, because the Ghostbusters will have forfeited her protection for cultural property. This is why I'm not allowed anywhere near a screenplay, and why the Ghostbusters franchise will probably ban me from ever talking about it again. But lawful but dangerous here. So just exercise some caution, Ghostbusters. We don't want you back in court for something else. Just be careful in your battles against